Hello all, and welcome back to a new episode of TV and Us, a conversation show about the TV series we just can't stop talking about. My name is Jennifer Hahn.
And I'm Sarah Callan.
And each season we focus on a different show, reviewing it episode by episode, and we invite you to watch along with us. Right now, we're reviewing Severance Season 2, and today we are on Episode 2, titled Goodbye, Mrs. Selvig. All right, Sarah, do you want to kick us off with an episode summary for Episode 2?
Sure. Audi Mark contemplates the meaning of a message. Lumen grapples with the fallout of the overtime contingency.
All right. So let's start off with our episode titles of choice for this second episode. Sarah, what is yours?
Mine is Half Step More Confirmation.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah. Gosh, there's much to discuss. Much to discuss with that. My episode title is Promo.
Nice. Yeah, there's quite a bit of promo here.
Right? All right. Well, let's dive in and share kind of our high-level thoughts about Episode 2. Then we'll give a spoiler and then dive fully right in. So, Sarah, how did this episode in general land with you?
Yeah, this episode I think works really well, and I think it's an interesting companion piece to the first episode. In the first episode, we spend all of our time on the severed floor. And it was just such an interesting choice to go from the end of season 1, where they can experience, the outside world for a second, and then we're immediately brought back to the severed floor, and we have so many questions about what's going on. And then in this episode, we get a few answers about what's going on. Some gaps are filled in about what our characters have gone through between the end of season 1 and the beginning of season 2. And I just thought that was such an interesting creative choice to, in the first episode, kind of give us a good reminder of what it's like on the severed floor and how our characters come to return there. And then in the second episode, we get more context about what they experienced that we didn't get to see. Because one of the questions that I had after the first episode was, when are we going to see their outside selves? And we see that in this episode. So I think structurally it makes a lot of sense. I like that it answers some questions and then it creates some additional questions. And we get to see some different sides of some of these characters that I think are pretty interesting. And I hope that the season will continue to explore. So yeah, it totally worked for me. How about you?
Yeah, it's funny because in our previous conversation about episode 1, you were specifically wondering about their outie selves. And I feel like this episode was such an answer to that desire of yours. So we got so much of their outie selves and nearly very little to none of their inside of Lumen selves. So a full answer to your desires and questions. Yeah, I think episode 1, as I mentioned in our conversation, really worked for me. This one didn't work as well for me. I don't know, and I was trying to reflect on which aspects weren't as engaging. I just found myself my mind wandering a little bit during this episode and was a little less engaged. And I feel like there are some reveals that happen, but for the most part, there's maybe just foundation laying, and I'm sure a lot will get answered and it's going to build towards something. But for right now, I was like, all right, cool. Noted on this detail, noted on that detail. I'm just going to file these away and hope you water this throughout the rest of the season. But I feel like there was just less that was interesting, funny, clever, and engaging, especially for pushing some of these characters forward. So it felt a lot more focused on some of her other characters, like Cobell, like Outside Helly, and I don't know. I was wanting to get back with our crew and their rebellion that they're hoping to stage here. And I think that obviously some of these details are important to communicate to us in the audience because this is their foe essentially. But I just found it less exciting, less fun. Maybe it's because we just didn't get that much Milchek throughout this episode too. I don't know what it is, but I think a lot of the ways that I feel like the information was being passed to me as the viewer was just a little bit more bland than usual.
I think that's fair. I feel like a lot of this episode is just people talking. There's not a lot of doing. There's not a lot of action in this at all. Like, it's primarily just people having conversations, which I am a sucker for just people having conversations. So that makes sense why this maybe worked for me. But I think for me, one of the most interesting pieces, and I won't dive into it too deeply because spoilers, but we get to spend quite a bit of time with Helena outside Helly. And I loved that. I ate all of that up. I have so many more questions about her now and just curious about what her life looks like and her goals and motivations and all of this, and like better understanding the position that she is in, I found fascinating. So I think a lot of the it's almost like political dealings that we see with Helena and Milchek too. Like they know what their goal is. They see an obstacle to getting that goal and they are working their magic to try and get what they want. And there's something about watching people do that is just so entertaining to me. And I think this episode also does a really good job continuing those themes about just shining a light on corporate culture and some of the really gross aspects of it and how employees are treated, hiring practices, promotions, and sometimes how they're given. So I think there's just a lot of interesting things in this episode conceptually. And I think that's probably why I was hooked in, because for me, that's my favorite part of the show, is just the concept. And this has a ton of that in it. Doesn't have a lot of action, but lots of talking, lots of interesting things to think about. But I can see how this would have been an easier one to maybe disengage with too.
Yeah. And I can see how like there's a lot of interesting things that can ignite some ponderings about the nature of our current work environments and how the powers that be manipulate the workers and their desires for their own purposes. I think this episode is like the opposite of what episode 1 does, really. Like in a lot of ways, episode 1 is so character forward. There's a lot of really clever and engaging and funny set pieces that I think were visually and cognitively really exciting. And this one's a lot more just planting seeds, igniting some thought trains, and I'm sure we're going somewhere next. But we are just beginning, and this episode definitely is just focusing. All right, so we are going to dive into all of the various plot points that happen in this episode. So if you haven't watched Severance Season 2, Episode 2 yet, this is your spoiler because we're diving right in. All right, Sarah, what are some big things that happened in this episode that were particularly noteworthy for you?
I'm still on the just decision to structure this season in this way, because this episode is like the how of how everybody got back to the office. We start out seeing everybody get back to the office in the first episode, and then this episode takes us back in time and fills us in on all of the events, all of the pulling of the strings from Miltrek to Helena to the board to get these characters back into the office. And I find that so fascinating that the first episode basically only on the severed floor, and then this episode is all outside. And that's fascinating. And I think is a really interesting choice that we'll see probably pay off throughout the season. But, these characters are severed and their lives are compartmentalized in such a unique way. And then in the final episode of season 1, it's all integrated. And their inside selves and their outside selves become one, and they understand what's going on. And then in these first 2 episodes, we are back to being compartmentalized, and the inside stays in the inside and the outside stays on the outside, and they are not allowed to meet except for Milchek can flow through them both. And I find that so interesting structurally. And I'm so curious where the show will continue to go this season, because that's just such an interesting choice. And the show is so deliberate in so much of I mean, it's deliberate in everything that it does. So to have these two episodes split this way, I think is just something interesting to think about.
Yeah, and it's different from a lot of the episodes that we got, I think, in season 1, where they tended to have a little bit more cross-cutting between the innies and the outies. Obviously, some episodes lean a little bit more heavily into one or the other, but I feel like in every episode, we would get at least a little bit of a snippet of some of the other world selves. And this structure is so different. I'm curious to see what they will choose to continue to do. I thought it was particularly interesting that when Milchek at the end of the episode is talking to Irv, he shares or suggests the idea that because his innie self is becoming more happy and more content and finding purpose and joy inside of the severed floor, that somehow that would begin to translate into his outie self. Like it wasn't super explicit or obvious because Milchek never is, but there seems to be a suggestion that he makes around like, yeah, your innie's like really finding community and joy and purpose. And like, don't worry, like over time, you outie self will begin to feel the effects of that too. And that's a concept that I feel like has not been articulated so clearly or suggested so clearly in the past, but seems to be one of the ways that Lumen is also advocating for why this is, quote unquote, that valuable and beneficial for these human beings. And so I thought that was a fascinating concept because up until this point, my understanding of the severed brain was truly like split in half. But it seems to be that there are these things that kind of cross mix together, both in potentially bad ways, but also in ways that Lumen can use as almost like a form of long form, twisted medical therapy to like help your brain become better and more happy overall. If half of it is better, like that will slowly bleed into the other parts of your brain that isn't quite there yet. And I think that's a fascinating concept that is beginning to be explored a little bit or suggested.
Yeah, and the other piece of it that I think is so interesting is Milchek has some sort of a relationship with both Irv and Dylan. And I find that so fascinating because we haven't seen Milchek really interacting with Mark outside of the severed floor. I don't think at all. And so it's just so interesting to see that he has been speaking with these men and is easily recognized by them. Irv seems to have some like real warmth toward Milchek. And so I'm just, again, my wheels are just going about like, how has Milchek been manipulating these two and getting them to stay satiated so that they continue to go to work every day? Like, so that's also how I viewed that conversation with Irv, is Milchek continuing to give him what he needs so that Irv will continue to come to work. Just Milchek continuing to know what somebody needs and then dangling that in front of them to get them to do what he wants them to do. Again, this is my very cynical self. I love watching Milchek. He's so fun. He's in this episode a bunch and I had a blast watching him. But man, you can just see how calculating he is with all of these interactions as he's trying to get these severed workers to come back to work.
Yeah, and he does it with a big cheeky smile for each of them as well. It is interesting because I wonder if Cobell was that maybe officially or even unofficially for Mark. Like, are each of them assigned almost somebody to keep an eye on them and ensure that they're complying and not beginning to ask too many questions or become suspicious about their roles in Lumen? I think it's a little bit likely different from Cobell because Cobell was kind of like undercover. She's pretending to be Mrs. Selvig and keeping an eye on Mark, but there's clearly like a specific role that she was playing as his next door neighbor to ensure that he is going to work. And I think one of the big interesting reveals that happens in this episode is the significance of Mark specifically going back to work, to the point where the board is willing to say, okay, yeah, macro data uprising, aftermath, we're still going to allow all of those other employees back because Mark has asked for it, and because he is so significant to this Cold Harbor file that needs to be refined. Like, they're willing to go so far to ensure that Mark will keep going back. So clearly there's a significance for Mark to be back at work and specifically working on that file that the end of episode 1 seems to suggest this tied to Gemma/Miss Casey in some way. So there's a lot more clues that I think we collect in this episode as far as that big question of what is Lumen doing and what is macro data refinement. And now we're seeing that there's a lot more insight about what might be happening there.
Yes, I was so pleased that they finally addressed that, because I have had that question from the beginning of, why is Mark so special? Because it never made sense to me. I was like, he's just some random dude. Like, why does it make sense for the floor manager to be living next to him and doing all of this for him? So I'm glad that the show understands that that is a question that some people, I don't know, it might have just been me, have, and is addressing that. Obviously, we don't know the full answer to that because we don't know what this mysterious project actually is, but I was so pleased. I was like, yes, this is a question I've been needing an answer to from the jump. Thank you for acknowledging my question.
Mm-hmm. And because their macro data refinement job has to do with numbers feeling scary, and then you think about the way that like the relational connections inside of Mark's brain are kind of tied to Gemma/Miss Casey in some way, that there's like a specific reason that he is assigned to that file as well. That has to mean something, you know, like only he can do that role for whatever reason, because hand wavy something technology science twistedness is happening behind the scenes. But that specifically is vital for him to be the one to do it. We're starting to get more clues. Honestly, I was team, I wish that like macro data refinement was literally just like meaningless job and purely just like a psychological experiment for them. I would have loved that reading, because there's some like really fun cynical meta points around like the some of the work that we do that feels like it's truly just purposeless, and what is it all for, you know? But I think the show is taking more of the approach of Lumen's definitely got something really shady going on, and the macro data refinement is actually tied to that in some way. So they seem to be taking that stance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's none of Dylan's crazy theories about what it is, like sharks or whatever. Yes. Okay, so no eels.
But are there goats?
But
the age-old question I have.
Honestly, though,
yeah, it
would appear that there are. So I don't know. We're gonna see. We're gonna see where Severance comes down on ghosts.
Yeah, maybe something to do with cloning, because I think that wasn't the first cloned like mammal egg. What was it, Dolly? Oh my!
I think it was a sheep, right? Wasn't it Dolly?
Yeah. So cloning.
Okay. All right.
And they're all little, and so you could just, you know, I don't know, breed a bunch of baby goats / sheep, and then run all of their science experiments on them to clone them. I don't know, but maybe it's all.
Gosh, I really hope that we get an answer on those goats, because there's just, it was so weird.
It isn't the free flop. It's my favorite detail that I hold on to.
We will have to keep watching, which
that's
we will.
The only thing that's
so that's
me
great.
Really that engaged in the show at this point. After the second episode, I'm like, well, I just want to know about this one question.
Okay.
Everything else is still continuing to be smoke and mirrors, and I feel my frustration rising.
Yep, which this show is very good at, is being frustrating and also good. Like, it's so well done, and at the same time, so frustrating. And so you kind of just need to keep watching.
Yep, exactly. Okay, any other big moments that we wanted to make sure that we hit? Mrs. Selvig / Cobell?
Yeah, we get some good harmony moments in this episode. She seems to get everything she had ever wanted, and then it's all gone.
Yeah.
Because she doesn't want to be played, so she walks away.
Yeah.
Which is pretty interesting.
I think that's one of the things that I'm also curious about is just how much Harmony is a loose cannon in the player dynamics of the characters on this show right now. And that final scene of this episode where Mark specifically asks her, do you know something about Gemma? And she clearly implies with her silence that she does. And yeah, I think she holds so much information, and that could be so useful. So it just is a matter of like how she will choose to use or not use that information and who she shares it with. That will be really fun.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what they do with her character, because she obviously clearly knows a lot. And we know that her whole life has been Lumen and devotion to Kier and like all of this. So how is she going to handle all of these, honestly, really big feelings? Because Lumen wasn't just work for her. Like, it almost seemed like it was almost like a religion for her. So how is she going to respond now that she is no longer associated with Lumen? You know, how is she going to use all of these secrets that she has? Because she knows a lot. So she is a potential agent of chaos, and I am very excited to see what happens next with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought it was so interesting, the scene with her and Helly and the offer of this promotion, air quotes, and point that you were making earlier around the ways that like the corporation will position something to you as if it's highly beneficial for you, you know, and then you kind of can like see through it all and it's pretty transparent. And you're like, you know, don't even try and package it up as something nice and helpful and valuable for me as if you're thinking about me. Like, just shoot me straight, you know? And I think that whole sequence was really interesting and fascinating. The way that they are both reading each other and also debunking each other's facades to really uncover what's beneath the surface and kind of have like a real actual conversation and see each other clearly in their intentions. So I thought that whole sequence was pretty well done and really reflective of some of the like big corporation organizational dynamics that happen that in reality with the way that the organizations treat their employees as if we don't understand what's going on, you know? Like don't try and sugarcoat it. Just shoot me straight.
Yeah. And I loved that interaction. It's so tense, and it's just these two women talking in this giant room. And I also love how they communicate with each other, because it's all so formal. And so like Harmony says to Helena, an apology is warranted. Like, who actually talks like that? But I think it just goes to this almost indoctrination that Harmony has gone through in making Lumen her whole life. And even after Helena apologizes, Harmony's response isn't like, oh, thank you. But she says, I welcome your contrition. I'm like, no one talks like this. But it was probably ingrained in her, is this is how you speak, and this is what it looks like to be the dispassionate leader that we need you to be. And I loved that conversation, because they both have been indoctrinated by this company. They've both been shaped into being a specific type of person and a specific type of leader. And I think it was so fascinating just to see Helena moving through all of these different scenarios, because she talks to Milchek, and then she talks to Harmony, and then she has to do her apology video, and all of these different scenarios that she finds herself, even in a conversation with the board. You know, she is having to keep it together and be professional and be not emotional, and everything needs to be measured and calculated and perfect. And it's so interesting seeing this different side of her when Helly is the exact opposite. And Helly is loud and passionate, and she's willing to fight for what she believes in and advocate for herself. And Helena is a completely different personality because she has had to be so buttoned down and so controlled her entire life. So I loved that contrast, and I'm so excited to see more of Helena and see if she begins to change maybe as she learns who Helly is, or I don't know, comes to see Helly more as a person rather than just a concept. Will Helena actually change, or how will she, I don't know, continue to side with Lumen? Like, there's so many things they can do with that character, and I'm very excited to see where she goes.
Yeah, the scene, the little short snippet that's included in this episode of Helena watching Helly have that whole romantic kiss with Mark S. I thought was so interesting to think about and imagine being in that situation yourself and watching this kind of other version of you that is so different from who you are and is spontaneous and follows their emotions and impulses with such freedom, and how odd that must be. But also there's this look on Helena's face where she's almost like amused by this other version of her that she almost like looks down upon. I mean, I'm thinking back to even in season 1, the way that Helena's outside self in her videos speaks to any Helly is so condescending and has this whole superiority complex. And so I think it's just fascinating to think about how outside Helena is even like viewing and maybe noticing other parts of Helly and how she's manifesting in the inside of the severed floor, and kind of what must be going through her mind in that instance. You know, just imagine watching yourself, this other version of you that looks exactly like you, talks like you, do all of these things and make choices that are so jarringly different from your current self in like every possible way is really fascinating. Obviously, outside Helena is incredibly loyal to her organization and believes in this mission. And inside Helly is like one of the ones that instigated the entire rebellion. And so to see these like two sides of the spectrum of yourself manifesting in this way must be quite the experience.
Yeah, when I was watching that scene, I was just, putting myself in her shoes and like, wow, what a weird experience to be seeing you on the screen talking with and flirting with and then kissing somebody that you don't know. Like,
yeah,
that would just be such a wild thing. So that was just such an interesting thing to think about. So again, this show is giving us we've been in the severed world for a while and we understand the concept, but I love that all throughout the show is constantly showing us different sides and different viewpoints of what it is actually like for the people who are severed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and putting yourself in these kind of situations that you really have to think and imagine what must that feel like to be in that situation. Just when you think you've kind of begun to understand it, it gives you one more scenario for you to mull on again. And especially Mark S being like the precise person that's like vital to her larger goal is also a really fun extra detail for the experience of watching your any self like flirt with and kiss the person that is your outside self. Is like, no, but we need this piece on the board to accomplish our larger mission. Is such a jarring set of emotions and circumstances.
Well, and it's also interesting given that some things bleed over from the two sides. So I wonder if because Mark is so important to Helena, Helly had maybe even a stronger affection for him than she might otherwise. So maybe that's really another piece of that concept.
That's a good theory. Yeah. There's an extra fixation on him because your other half of your brain has a fixation on him for very different reasons. But alas, he is swirling inside of your brain at a higher rate. Okay. Well, shall we give out some TVNS awards?
Sure.
Okay, let's do it. The first category is Employee of the Week, given to a character on the show that is encompassing this in whatever dimension we choose to award this gift. Okay, Sarah, what is your choice for Employee of the Week?
I want to give this to Devin for not snitching on Mark to Milchek.
Yeah. That is awesome. Yeah, there's some fascinating, tense interactions that happen between all of these people. I am also giving Employee of the Week to Devin for relentlessly pursuing the thread of like, no, but let's revisit. Like, what did you mean when you said she's alive? Like, we can't just gloss over this. Like, it's worth investigating. So she is continuing to be faithful in getting to the bottom of this. And as a viewer of this show, I am rooting for her because I also want to know what is at the bottom of this. So she is my stand-in.
Yeah, Devin is a real one. We're rooting for her.
We are indeed. Okay, the second category is Move the Needle Moment. What is your choice for this award?
Yeah, I want to give this to when Dylan is in his interview and he asks the interviewer about benefits, and the interviewer responds, "There's a coffee maker."
Yeah.
I was like, yeah, buddy, way to go. That is a real benefit these days.
Oh man, that whole interview was so painful to watch because it is so accurate sometimes of the interview experience. One of my favorite parts of that interview is, if you could be any kind of door, what would it be?
Yes.
Yes, we do get questions like that in interviews where it's just like, I don't know if this is really assessing my candidacy, but all right, we'll play this game. My choice for Move the Needle Moment is the reveal of the Cold Harbor file. I think that's really fun because we get that kind of mic drop moment at the end of episode 1, and we get some more insight into what that might be. So that was fun.
And some more questions too.
Yep. Okay, the third category is Achievement and Corporatees. What is your choice for this award?
Yeah, I want to give it to when Milchek says the OTC disclosure can be found in your start paperwork.
Yeah. You're like, oh, you mean on page like 72 of my entire contract of like size 10 font? Okay, thanks. Thanks for that. Appreciate it. Yeah, that's good. My choice for this award is when that door company employer says to Dylan, "We'll consider your application thoroughly," as he clearly is saying, sorry, you're not a good fit.
Poor Dylan.
Yeah. Yep.
Felt so bad for him.
Yeah. Okay, looking ahead, what are you excited to see as we head into episode 3?
Yeah, I want to know what Harmony is going to do next, because she is clearly dealing with some big feelings and she could do anything. And then I also want to know what's going on with Christopher Walken. Where is Bert? We see a very quick shot of him in this episode, and I want more Bert in this show. So that's what I want.
Yeah, that would be great. And clearly Irv is thinking about it too, outside Irv. So there's hope. There's hope we'll get more of him. Yeah, I think one of the big things I'm intrigued to see is Cobell's kind of like third axis amongst this group, and kind of her being the loose cannon. I think she's going to be just pivotal to this season, and it's going to be explosive. So I'm excited to see how that plays out. And then, yeah, I'm intrigued to see more of the plan that any characters come up with. I hope that next episode we get more of them, because I find them the most interesting for how they're going to figure out how to navigate all of this and come up with a plan somehow to fight for this. They clearly have a united mission. I just would like to see progress on said mission. Or regression, that's fine, but we got to move in some direction or another. So I'm excited to see that. All right. Well, this was our review and discussion of Severance, episode 2. You can find it available on Apple TV+. Thank you for listening to this episode of TV and Us. Our name sums it up. We're big fans of TV and the powerful ways we can connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories. So everyone is welcome here, and we're so glad you spent time with us today as we continue our journey through Severance Season 2. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you tune into your favorite shows. Drop us a rating and review, letting us know your thoughts about episode 2. You can connect with us on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky at TBNSPod, or email us at tbnspod@gmail.com. We will be back soon to discuss episode 3, continuing on to get some answers to all of our questions. We hope you have an amazing week, and we'll talk again with y'all next week.